the Leadership Rosetta Stone. This video is based on my book, The Leadership Rosetta Stone, which is available in paperback or Kindle on Amazon. All my leadership training videos are on topics that tie directly back to the universal leadership model. This helps students of leadership quickly pinpoint how this aspect of leadership relates to the other aspects of leadership. If you aren't already familiar with the universal leadership model, even though it encompasses every aspect of leadership in a single diagram, it is actually fairly straightforward. At the center of the model are the follower worldviews and the leadership styles that must be properly paired with them in order for the leader to be viewed as credible in the eyes of the followers. Then we have the three inherent leadership responsibilities: planning, teaming, and executing. And finally, we have the 9 leadership core competencies on the outer ring. These are also referred to as the 9 leadership core practices or 9 skill sets all competent leaders possess. The universal leadership model mentioned here is based on my book of the same name, which is available on Amazon in paperback or Kindle. The topic of this video is the follower worldviews and the leadership styles that must be properly paired with them in order for the leader to be seen as credible in the eyes of the followers. Follower worldviews are seen here on the universal leadership model. Leadership styles are seen here on the universal leadership model. The Leadership Rosetta Stone, when first introduced in the early 2000s, represented the world's first unifying theory of leadership that's at the heart of what is now referred to as integral leadership. To understand its significance, first we should remind ourselves of what the historic Rosetta Stone is in the first place. As you may recall from your history lessons, the historic Rosetta Stone is an ancient Egyptian artifact on which the same information is inscribed in 3 languages. Those 3 languages are Egyptian hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Greek. The discovery of the historic Rosetta Stone allowed anthropologists and linguists to decode the language of Egyptian hieroglyphs for the very first time in history. So this term, Rosetta Stone, is often used idiomatically to describe any critical key that unlocks something previously difficult or impossible to decipher. So in simple terms, a Rosetta Stone is a key that unlocks the hidden or encrypted meaning of something. Nearly all leadership theory texts and books that claim the best way to lead describe the writer's subjective ideas about which leadership approaches, strategies, and tactics that they believe will work best with followers based upon their assumptions about the world and the people being led. This last part turned out to be the key, so I'll highlight it. I said based on their assumptions about the world. We discovered that with very rare exceptions, the authors of these leadership theories and books, their own inherent assumptions about the world and people, including their values and worldview biases, lined up with the 4 commonly accepted worldviews that I'd learned about from my mentor, Ken Wilber, along with the great psychologists of the last 100 years, including Jean Piaget, cognitive psychology, Abraham Maslow, needs, Claire Graves, values, Lawrence Kohlberg, moral development, Jean Gebser, value systems and worldviews, Robert Keegan, developmental psychology, William Torbert, stages of leadership maturity, and pretty much all of the other psychologists that we'd studied that tie their work to mindsets and worldviews. So worldviews turned out to be the key to unlocking the world's first universal theory of leadership. When we group the various leadership theories, approaches, techniques, and tools by the worldview of their advocates, especially the author or creator of that leadership theory or approach, we see that in the vast majority of cases, those methods do work pretty well for followers who share that worldview, because those are the specific followers the theorist had in mind, along with all the biases and assumptions that went along with it, when they posited and promoted that leadership theory. The real problem is that the vast majority of theorists are not aware of the diversity of worldviews and incorrectly assume that all followers share a similar mindset, psychological makeup, value system, or worldview. In other words, these theorists projected their own unconscious worldview bias their values, onto followers and made the incorrect assumption that all followers were homogenous with the same worldview. Perhaps you've noticed this issue when you've read articles or books about leadership. The authors rarely offer a qualification or a distinction in the form of, this leadership approach will work well with people with traditional worldviews, but will very likely backfire with people with postmodern worldviews. Rather, in nearly every case, the creators and advocates of a given leadership theory or approach simply claimed, this approach will work with all followers. This key unlocked and solved the puzzle of why nearly every leadership theory contradicted nearly every other leadership theory, creating a jumbled mess that was the field of leadership theory 20 years ago when we created this, and to a large degree is still present today. Integral theory provides us with an easy way, if you know what to look for, to identify people's worldviews. If you know what you're looking for, it's pretty obvious. There are only 4, and in most organizations, mainly 3 follower worldviews. Once we correctly identify a follower's worldview, then we'll know with a great deal of accuracy which leadership styles and approaches will be most resonant with them, that they will feel drawn to, will likely trust, and will likely willingly follow. And importantly, followers will happily volunteer their discretionary effort to leaders who use their preferred leadership style. We use a lot of repetition in this program to help you memorize and internalize the 4 worldviews and the 4 styles, as this is the crucial key to having more influence and more impact with your followers. I'll review these 4 worldviews in a sequential order based upon how common they are in the workplace. Of course, some organizational cultures are different, but in most growth companies, we see the frequency of these worldviews in this order: modern, then postmodern, then traditional, and finally imperial. The 4 universal worldviews. The modern worldview. The modern age emerged during the historical Western Enlightenment and the dawn of scientific thinking that we associate with the Renaissance, which eventually led to the Industrial Age. View of the world. People with this worldview tend to believe in the advancement of humankind through the application of the rational mind and its scientific, technological, and medical manifestations. Values. People with this worldview value success, achievement, excellence, competence, competition, expertise, status, science and reason, progress, and winning. Approach to life. They approach life as a game or a competition to be met and mastered by finding the best way to capitalize on life's limitless opportunities. People with this worldview tend to believe that there are many valid ways to think and behave, but there is usually one best way: preferred leadership style. People with a modern worldview will always find the strategic leadership style most credible and will always prefer to follow leaders who use this style. The postmodern worldview. The postmodern worldview first emerged in the 1960s with the advent of computer technology, networking, and globalization, and we associate it with the information age view of the world. People with this worldview believe the world is a diverse web of interrelationships where life forms depend on each other for survival, and there's no single explanatory system or view of reality that can account for all the phenomena of life. Rather, there are many truths. This is called pluralism. Values. People with this worldview value inclusivity, equality, diversity, sustainability, authenticity, personal growth, and making a difference. Approach to life. They approach life as an ecosystem where cooperation is better than competition, and they prefer to gather in inclusive, diverse communities where everyone is expected to be treated as an equal. People with this worldview tend to believe that there are many valid ways to think and behave, but there's no real way to judge the superiority of one way over another. That's called relativism. Preferred leadership style. People with a postmodern worldview will always find the collaborative leadership style, also called the inclusive leadership style, most credible and will always prefer to follow leaders who use this style. The traditional worldview. The traditional worldview initially emerged historically with the monotheistic religious traditions and the Roman Empire. And we see it starting with the Iron Age and continuing through the Middle Ages. People with this worldview see the world as an ordered existence under the control of a higher authority and governed by absolute truth. Values. People with this worldview value hierarchy, order, obedience, security, stability, and conformity, meaning strictly conforming to traditional roles and traditional religious beliefs. Approach to life. They approach life in a concrete, literal, fundamentalist, ethnocentric, and nationalistic manner. Right versus wrong, good versus evil, us versus them, and they're not fond of equality, diversity, or inclusivity. People with this worldview tend to believe there's only one right way to think and behave. Preferred leadership style. People with a traditional worldview will always find the bureaucratic style, also called authority style, most credible and will always prefer to follow leaders who use this style. The Imperial worldview. The Imperial worldview first emerged in society during the time of feudal kingdoms and is roughly equivalent to the Bronze Age and is still very much alive and well today. View of the world. People with an imperial worldview see the world made up of predators and prey, where the strongest and most cunning survive, gain power, and satisfy their wants. They tend to see others as either being allies or enemies or objects to be manipulated. Values. People with this worldview value personal protection, personal power, respect, dominance, and freedom from any behavioral constraints. Approach to life. People with an imperial worldview are anti-establishment, nonconformists. They tend to be fiercely independent, living by their own rules. They are risk takers, driven to break free from any perceived limits, achieve their goals, and impose their will. People with this worldview tend to believe the best way to think and behave is my way. Preferred leadership style. People with an imperial worldview will always find the autocratic leadership style most credible and will always prefer to follow leaders who use this style. Now that we've reviewed the 4 worldviews, in this next section, we'll look more closely at the 4 universal leadership styles that must be paired with people who share those corresponding worldviews in order to be viewed as a credible leader in the eyes of your followers. I will remind you again that if you, as a leader, use the wrong leadership style with the wrong follower or group of followers, you run a very high risk of undermining your leadership credibility in their eyes and coming across to them as clueless, or in the worst case, even foolish. Each of these worldviews, which represent 4 different follower types, views credible and trustworthy leadership very differently. In other words, each of these worldviews has a very different definition of effective leadership and a very different list of qualities and characteristics they look for in leaders who they view as credible. And these lists are mutually exclusive. To make this less conceptual and more concrete, I'll offer one quick, simple example that I think you'll be familiar with. The issues around hierarchical and authority-based leadership are significant, and there's a strong trend among some managers, especially outside consultants and coaches, to strongly push for this new collaborative, inclusive leadership with the goal of eliminating hierarchy and all top-down authority-style leadership that is so common in the corporate world. I'm confident you've seen or even tripped over this sticky dynamic. And unless you're a student of integral psychology, you've probably not had it described in such clear, unambiguous terms as we do in this program. Here's a real-life familiar example to bring the ideas in this lesson alive for you. Followers with a traditional worldview believe that leadership is positional and that leaders are on a hierarchy above them. This is somewhat analogous to how parents are above their children and have the authority to tell them what to do. People with a traditional worldview not only like hierarchy, they need hierarchy. They see the world in terms of hierarchy. To them, the world is a hierarchy, with people with authority telling the people below them the right way to think and behave, with rewards for compliance and punishment for non-compliance. And to these people with a traditional worldview, a credible leader, in their eyes, uses hierarchy and the authority that comes with it to tell the people on the next rung down that hierarchy exactly what to do. Sort of like how military leaders give orders to the people below them. Now, let's contrast that with followers who hold the postmodern worldview. Followers with a postmodern worldview despise hierarchy and find it downright offensive. Followers with a postmodern worldview are convinced that credible, trustworthy leaders don't use hierarchy. From this view, credible leaders are inclusive leaders who treat everyone as an equal and strive for consensus by seeking everyone's opinion and input before making key decisions. Hopefully you can see the problem. This is a clash of worldviews, beliefs, assumptions, and expectations about leadership. This creates huge problems in many organizations and literally brings the culture wars, as they're called in the media, right into your organization. In fact, as we'll see, many of these culture warriors, especially the postmodern types, will turn your organization into the front lines of these culture wars if you let them. I use these examples to help you really get that this is not academic. These are very real consequences for leaders and organizations who don't understand these values conflicts and these very different views of credible leadership and effective leadership. People are judging you as a leader, and their yardstick is a function of their worldview. Few leadership experts are equipped to discuss this very sticky and slightly controversial issue because they don't know anything about leadership and follower psychology, which explains follower worldviews and leadership paradigms. Fortunately, we're equipped with integral psychology. So together, we're going to wade gently into these deeper waters and discuss some culturally sensitive issues that are better to be brought out into the light than attacking us from the shadows. In the U.S. and many Western countries over the past decade, we've seen a massive trend of managers and executives, and especially consultants and coaches, embracing the postmodern values of diversity, equality, and inclusion, DEI for short, and then go on a passionate crusade to bring these values to the forefront of every organization that they're a member of, a coach, or consultant to. Their stated goal: dismantle hierarchy. Well, as I like to say, what could possibly go wrong with that? It turns out a whole lot can go wrong with that. Eliminating hierarchy is not only naive and idealistic, it's stupid and dangerous. Do not eliminate hierarchy if you value organizational success. Reducing hierarchy and having less levels can be helpful and will be welcome in cultures with predominantly postmodern values, workers, and leaders, but you must proceed with extreme caution, because if the organization is not 80 to 90% postmodern, eliminating hierarchy will very likely destroy performance and could bankrupt the company. But to many DEI activists, as I call them, all hierarchy is bad and should be dismantled, and all leaders must be inclusive, and all leaders must treat everyone as an equal. To many of these DEI advocates and activists, inclusivity and equality are the highest priorities, much more important than productivity or profitability. Worse, if an executive tries to resist, question, or push back against these extreme postmodern views, they run the risk of being attacked as having unconscious bias, of using hierarchy to dominate or exploit, or they are accused of being patriarchal and promulgating privilege, a very serious offense. Clearly, anyone with a college education and even a tiny bit of moral development understands the merits of the values of equality, inclusivity, and diversity. Everyone values equality, inclusivity, and diversity, but not everyone elevates those values to the very top of their values hierarchy and believes, for example, that inclusivity is a higher value than, say, productivity or profitability. Of course, we want our organizations to incorporate these values as the right thing to do, and we do not want any discrimination or mistreatment of any of our employees by other employees or managers. In most states in the U.S. and in most countries, discrimination is illegal. No one is questioning the values of diversity, equality, and inclusion, that they have merit and have an important place in organizational life. However, the problem is that only about 20 to 25% of organizations in the US and Western countries have employees and a culture that is made up of predominantly postmodern values. In many industries, more than half and often 2/3 of the employees, including the founders, board of directors, and leadership team, do not share that postmodern worldview. Rather, they hold a traditional worldview or a modern worldview. And for them, the idea that inclusivity is the highest value, higher than productivity or profitability, seems ridiculous, naive, foolhardy, and even dangerous to the sustainability of their for-profit organization. And they are exactly right. But they're afraid to speak up out of fear of appearing out of touch or privileged. As you will recall, people with traditional values like hierarchy, value hierarchy, and need hierarchy to function. Removing hierarchy in a traditional paradigm organization, and many modern paradigm organizations too, will likely destroy the company within a few years. Yet I've yet to meet a DEI advocate who qualifies their recommendations about eliminating hierarchy and emphasizing inclusive leadership. In my experience, and likely yours too, postmodern consultants and coaches simply push their own postmodern unconscious bias on all organizations indiscriminately. Perhaps you recognize the irony here. Extreme postmodern types push their sacrosanct value of diversity, yet they expect everyone in every organization to adopt their values and worldview, and leave no room for leaders who don't share their values or their postmodern worldview. In other words, while they value diversity of ethnicity and gender, they don't value diversity of worldviews and leadership paradigms. These are not bad people. In fact, they are generally very good people with really good hearts. They just have a huge blind spot, and they think they are justified in pushing their postmodern worldview and the values that go with it on all organizations indiscriminately, even traditional organizations and modern organizations. Worse, they tend to see leaders with traditional and modern values as privileged, hierarchical, and patriarchal. This has created a weird dynamic where traditional and modern leaders who prefer hierarchy and see it as necessary, who value productivity over inclusivity, and who don't see much value in treating everyone as an equal, feel the need to act inclusive and pretend to be inclusive out of fear that they'll be attacked by the DEI activists as having unconscious bias, being hierarchical, patriarchal, or in the worst case, racist. If you've ever wrestled with this slippery beast, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. I've counseled and advised hundreds of C-suite executives wrestling with this very sticky and frankly risky and dangerous issue. You do not want to battle the postmodern DEI activists. It's not a battle you can win. Be very wary of inviting extreme postmodern coaches and consultants into your organization unless you are prepared to face an unconscious bias tribunal and are willing to undertake a re-education, unconscious bias indoctrination to rid you of your hierarchical, privileged, and patriarchal ways. My reason for using such colorful language here is to make sure that you fully grasp that the principles and frameworks in this lesson are not merely some academic concept or pet theory. This lesson highlights the most fundamental aspects of leadership psychology and interpersonal psychology, one that's not commonly understood or appreciated by most leaders, consultants, coaches, or even authors who write books about leadership and culture. Here is the principle at work that underlies the Leadership Rosetta Stone in particular, and integral leadership in general. People trust people who share their values and worldviews. And people are often skeptical or even antagonistic toward people with different values and worldviews. This is a fact of life. If you are moving through your organization blind to the value systems and worldviews of the people you're interacting with, in about a third of the interactions, you are likely coming across to your employees as someone who doesn't get it, who's out of touch, or who doesn't really understand how the world really is, as defined by their specific value system and worldview, with all the assumptions and biases implicit in it. The moral of this story is this: to have credibility and influence as a leader, you have to be able to recognize the value systems and worldviews of people around you and speak and act accordingly. We must understand that at least 3 of these worldviews are alive and well in our organizations. Each worldview has its own very specific set of values, assumptions, and beliefs. When leaders, consultants, or coaches push their unconscious worldview bias onto others, it creates numerous problems and can be very destructive to leadership credibility, organizational alignment, team trust, and the health of your corporate culture. People have a right to adopt whatever values and worldview they want. That is their legal right in a liberal democracy. As leaders, it's our job and our responsibility to appreciate people's psychology, especially their value systems and worldviews, and weave a colorful tapestry of organizational culture that works for the people in that organization. Some organizations will be much more heavily traditional, modern or postmodern. Further, it's the right and prerogative of the founders and leaders of any organization to build a culture that emphasizes certain values over others. And it's their right to encourage new hires to self-select in to those values and that culture or opt out. If we are to be effective as leaders in diverse organizations, we must become values literate and worldviews literate. And that is precisely the purpose of the Leadership Rosetta Stone model. Okay, with that as a very deliberate and sober conversation about values and worldviews in our organizations, I want you to take this stuff seriously. Now, we can lighten up this conversation and start to have some fun with the 4 different leadership styles and the people in our organization that they'll respond to. You already have one of these leadership styles down pat. I call that your native style. For many of you, it will be the modern leadership paradigm, which I call the strategic leadership style. Or perhaps you have the postmodern leadership paradigm down. I call that the collaborative leadership style. Or maybe you have a military or manufacturing background, and you are most comfortable with the more hierarchical, traditional leadership paradigm, what I call bureaucratic leadership, and I also call it authority leadership. The key to greater leadership success is to expand your repertoire and increase your leadership style versatility by getting better at one of these other styles that a lot of your followers respond better to than your native style. So let's review the 4 styles, and this time let's add more nuance. the 4 universal leadership styles. First, let's review short definitions for each. Again, in this lesson, I'm going to be listing them in the order we see them most commonly in organizational life and growth companies. Strategic leadership. The person with the most expertise leads via strategic planning and aligned incentives. In short, this leadership style is based on reason, logic, and expertise. Collaborative leadership. It's often called inclusive leadership and humanistic leadership. Leadership is not vested in any one person. Rather, it emerges from the inclusive collective via consensus in service of the greater good. In short, this leadership style is based on equality and consensus. Bureaucratic leadership, also called authority leadership. The person with positional authority leads via hierarchy and chain of command. This style is based on authority, rules, and compliance. Autocratic leadership. The person with the most power leads via command and control. In short, this leadership style is based on power and control, also called strongman leadership. Now that you have a basic idea of what these 4 styles are, I'll elaborate on the simple definitions and add a more detailed description of each style. Strategic leadership. This style is also known as expert leadership. Some academics who are strongly based toward the next style, collaborative leadership, will refer to strategic leadership as transactional leadership. Simple definition. The person with the most expertise leads via strategic planning and aligned incentives. Approach. This style reflects a transactional approach to leadership. When using this style, leaders leverage expertise, best practices, and aligned incentives to motivate teams to execute strategic plans in order to outperform their competitors. Appreciated by people with modern worldviews who value success, achievement, excellence, competence, competition, expertise, status, science and reason, progress and winning, and who seek opportunities to advance toward their individual goals, and who prefer to follow leaders who are perceived as having the most expertise and ability to achieve goals. Collaborative leadership. This is also known as inclusive leadership, humanistic leadership, transformational leadership, and self-managed teams. Simple definition. Leadership is not vested in any one person. Rather, it emerges from the collective via inclusive dialogue and consensus in the service of the greater good. Approach. This style reflects what academics call a transformational approach to leadership. When using this style, leaders strive for inclusiveness and equality by inviting people's input and feelings via dialogue to arrive at consensus. This style attempts to draw out the human potential of their followers and work together collaboratively toward common goals. This approach strongly favors self-managed teams over single leader-led teams. Appreciated by, of course, people with a postmodern worldview who value inclusivity, equality, diversity, sustainability, authenticity, personal growth, connection, and making a difference. And of course, who prefer to follow leaders who are perceived as being inclusive, socially aware, sensitive to the well-being of others, and who strive for consensus and always treat others as equals. Bureaucratic leadership, also known as authority leadership, rule-based leadership, and simply traditional leadership. Simple definition. The person with positional authority leads via hierarchy and chain of command. Approach. This style reflects a hierarchical approach to leadership. When using this style, leaders compel followers to dutifully comply with the established protocols, coordinate efforts, and meet the requirements prescribed by the authority. This style is the most parental of all the styles. The leader is in the position of parent, and the followers are in the position of child. Appreciated by people who hold traditional values and beliefs, who place a high emphasis on what they perceive to be absolute truth coming from a higher authority, who value obedience, security, and strictly conforming to traditional roles, and who prefer to follow leaders who are perceived as having positional authority, or who have what they believe to be moral authority as defined by their traditional and absolutistic beliefs. Autocratic leadership. Simple definition: the person with the most power leads via command and control. Approach. This style reflects a unilateral approach to leadership. When using this style, leaders impose their will through reputation, fear, and respect, tightly control information and choices, reward compliance, and punish disloyalty. The oldest of the styles is the way you would expect a ruler, such as a king or dictator, to rule their subjects. It's still extremely popular today, both with some leaders and also with a surprisingly large percentage of followers and also voters. Appreciated by people with imperial worldviews who value personal protection, personal power, respect, dominance, and freedom from any behavioral constraints, and who prefer to follow leaders who are perceived as being the strongest, toughest, and most dominant, and who will be able to protect them from or defeat their enemies. Another word for leaders who use this style is strongman leaders. Pairing leadership styles with follower worldviews. Repetition is the mother of skill. I want you to really internalize and memorize some of these phrases so this becomes your own. This really should be starting to make logical sense at this point. People with a modern worldview will naturally find strategic leadership most credible. Follow the logic here. It makes sense. Modern worldview followers are looking for the leader to be the person with the most expertise, who is most likely to be able to help them achieve their goals. Again, if you use any of the other three styles with a person with a modern worldview, you run the risk of undermining your credibility as you don't exhibit the qualities and the approaches that they associate with credible leaders and competent leadership. Let's do the next one. People with a postmodern worldview will find the collaborative, also called inclusive, leadership style most credible. This is also known as humanistic leadership and transformational leadership. Again, follow the logic here. Postmodern followers are looking for the leader to be highly inclusive, to treat everyone as an equal, to encourage all followers to share their perspectives and who strive for consensus. It makes sense, right? Again, if you use any of the other three styles with a person with a postmodern worldview, you run the risk of undermining your credibility, as they may not see you as a legitimate leader. They might use the phrase a conscious leader. Followers with a traditional worldview will find bureaucratic leadership, also called authority leadership, most credible. Naturally, traditional followers are looking for a leader who is higher on the organizational hierarchy and is perceived to have positional authority over them and who will enforce the rules. Of course they would. Again, if you use any of the other three styles with a person with a traditional worldview, you run the risk of undermining your credibility because they won't see you as a legitimate leader according to what they look for in a leader. Finally, followers with an imperial worldview will find the autocratic leadership credible. These followers look for a leader who is perceived to be powerful and can use their power to get things done. If you use any of the other three styles with a person with an imperial worldview, you run the risk of undermining your credibility with these types of followers. I want to encourage you to become more comfortable translating your leadership messages into these different worldview dialects. Becoming familiar with these guidelines for each of the follower worldviews is the first step to increasing your leadership style versatility. In time, As you get more comfortable using these 4 different leadership styles, in addition to reframing your messages using the values and priorities of each of the followers' worldviews, you'll also start to get the hang of the approach each of these styles uses. For example, the collaborative style is very inclusive and invites everyone to share their perspective and their feelings and strives for consensus before making decisions. And this works great with followers with a postmodern worldview who want leaders to treat everyone as an equal, seek input in an inclusive way, and strive for consensus. Whereas the bureaucratic style, I also call it the authority style, is explicitly hierarchical. And the people with the authority make the decisions and tell the employees what to do. And people with a traditional worldview very strongly prefer that their leaders make the decisions and simply tell them what to do. Of course, as we have discussed, the postmodern followers who despise hierarchy and expect credible leaders to treat everyone as an equal and be inclusive in decision-making find the hierarchical, authority-centric, bureaucratic style to be downright offensive. Conclusion. Practice using the specific guidelines with your followers based on their worldviews. With practice, this will come naturally to you, and you'll find that your employees are much more resonant with the leadership style you are using with them. This video has been an introduction and overview of the follower worldviews and the leadership styles that must be paired with them for the leader to be viewed as credible in the eyes of those followers. The information in this video is based on my book, The Leadership Rosetta Stone. You can pick this book up at Amazon, either in paperback or Kindle version. If you are responsible for a team, a department, division, or company, you may want to visit my website at integralassociates.com to learn more about our numerous self-paced courses, live trainings, and one-on-one and group coaching programs. Our programs are considered by many in the industry to be the best leadership training and coaching programs available anywhere at any price.